When you hear the names Tom and Jerry, you'll probably think of the cat and mouse who've been chasing each other across TV screens for more than 80 years. But did you know there was another Tom and Jerry? And no, not a cocktail, but cartoon characters. Two human cartoon characters who actually came first, but who history has almost completely forgotten. Let's get into it.
Fantasy, sci-fi, nostalgia, reruns of it.
In 1931, Van Beuren Studios, one of New York's busiest yet lesser remembered cartoon studios, introduced us to a pair of human buddies named Tom and Jerry. The studio was run by Amadee J. Van Beuren, a businessman rather than an artist, who wanted to compete with the likes of Disney and Fleischer. Van Beuren's cartoons were distributed through RKO Pictures, the same company that would release King Kong and distribute Disney's early shorts. Originally, Van Beuren's team toyed with making Tom and Jerry a cat and a dog duo, but decided human comedians gave them more room for quirky expression. The characters were designed by John Foster and George Stallings, and animated under the loose production oversight of Paul Terry's former staff, many of whom had migrated from the early Aesop's Fable series that Van Beuren had inherited after Terry left. The result was a bumbling slapstick human pair, somewhere between Laurel and Hardy and Mutt and Jeff. Between 1931 and 1933, Van Beuren produced about 26 Tom and Jerry shorts, including titles like What a Night, Pots and Pans, and Piano Tuners. Audiences enjoyed them for surreal humor and breakneck pacing, but they never climbed to the iconic status of Mickey Mouse, Betty Boop, or even Crazy Cat. They were deliberately modeled on the tall and short comedy of Mutt and Jeff, a style that John Foster, George Stallings, and George Ruffel brought into the Van Beuren cartoons. George Ruffel spent time at Fleischer and is best remembered for directing and animating much of the Tom and Jerry run at Van Beuren before continuing on to other studios like Terrytoons, Walter Lantz Productions, Warner Brothers, and Famous Studios. Stallings had been in animation since the 1910s, directing early Bray shorts like Colonel He's a Liar and Crazy Cat, and he's often credited with popularizing the rotating animation disc that became standard on drawing boards. By the time he arrived at Van Beuren in 1931, he'd already logged years in the business, and he eventually rose to head of the studio's animation department before later moving on to Disney, where he worked on stories for Fantasia, Bambi, and Song of the South. Between them, Stallings and Ruffel brought decades of experience, a toolbox of tricks, and even a few technical innovations, like Ruffel's patented Ruffel baton timing device, to a series that looked crude on the surface, but was built by serious professionals. George Ruffel's patented Ruffel baton was an early mechanical trick for locking cartoon action to music in the early sound era. Ruffel's system used a thin rod with a small white ball at the end, photographed along the far left side of the frame in the area where the optical soundtrack would later be printed. As each frame was shot, the cameraman moved the ball up and down according to a tempo chart, turning it into a kind of visual metronome for the studio orchestra. Musicians could then record in perfect sync by following that bouncing dot, and on some surviving Van Beuren prints, like certain copies of Barking Dogs, you can still spot a faint ghost of the baton bobbing at the edge of the picture, a tiny reminder of how much ingenuity went into timing these otherwise rough cartoons. Van Beuren didn't exist in a vacuum. It was part of a New York cartoon triangle with Fleischer and Terrytoons, all cranking out shorts just a subway ride apart. Artists and ideas flowed between these studios, so Van Beuren's cartoons ended up looking like a scrappier, budget Fleischer cartoon. Rubber hose limbs, jazzy music, and surreal transformations that feel like off-brand Betty Boop nightmares. Exhibitors were constantly comparing reels from all three outfits, which pushed everyone to one-up each other with wilder gags, stranger imagery, and eventually, bigger moves like color and more elaborate musical scoring. Van Beuren never became the trendsetter, but its chaotic, dreamlike shorts helped define that early 30s anything-can-happen cartoon language that Fleischer and others later polished and made famous. What's fascinating about this early run is how weird some of the cartoons were. Van Buren's team didn't have the polish or budgets of Disney or Fleischer, but they leaned into surreal, dreamlike comedy. In The Magic Mummy from 1933, Tom and Jerry chase a stolen sarcophagus into a graveyard, where skeletons play ribs like xylophones and a mummy transforms into a living Egyptian princess. It's creepy, chaotic, and oddly ahead of its time. A clear experiment in combining horror themes with humor. Other shorts plunged them into jazz clubs, haunted houses, and even fairy tale parodies. The humor often bordered on nonsensical, dancing cutlery, walking banjos, and furniture that comes alive. Still, like many early 1930s cartoons, they weren't without problems. Racial and ethnic caricatures were sadly common, and those depictions have kept many of the original prints out of modern circulation. Combined with the studio's lower production quality, that's why these cartoons aren't seen on TV today, only through fan restorations and public domain archives. One really interesting footnote, a young Joseph Barbera, who later co-created the famous cat and mouse Tom and Jerry at MGM, worked as an animator and storyboard artist on this earlier human Tom and Jerry series. In other words, the same man was involved with both Tom and Jerry's, first in New York at Van Buren, and then in Hollywood at MGM just a few years later. It almost feels like a strange kind of recycling. The names Tom and Jerry moved from two struggling human comics in cheap shorts to a sleek, Technicolor cat and mouse who would win Oscars and become global icons. Here's where things take a twist of cartoon fate. By the early 1940s, MGM launched their now iconic Tom and Jerry, the cat and mouse created by William Hanna and Joseph Barbera. The new duo exploded in popularity, instantly overshadowing the old human characters. When these old cartoons were revived for the early TV and home movie market, they ran into a branding problem. By then, MGM's cat and mouse, Tom and Jerry, were Oscar winners and pop culture giants, while Van Buren's human Tom and Jerry were obscure relics from a dead studio. So, in the 1950s, when a new distributor, Official Films, bought up the rights, they quietly retitled the shorts, redubbing the characters as Dick and Larry on new prints and TV packages to avoid confusing station managers and audiences who expected the MGM duo. Those rebranded versions quietly circulated for a few years and then faded into obscurity as Van Buren Studios itself shut down in 1936 after losing its distribution deal with RKO. One more interesting note, What a Night, the very first Tom and Jerry cartoon, is often cited as one of the earliest horror-themed animated shorts, predating the trend of cartoon creepiness that Fleischer Studios would later perfect with characters like Betty Boop. So whatever happened to the other Tom and Jerry? Well, they were overshadowed, renamed, and mostly forgotten. But if you dig into animation history, you'll find their bizarre adventures are still out there. Rough around the edges? Sure, but brimming with imagination. Several restored versions even pop up on YouTube and archive.org for those curious enough to take a peek back in animation's experimental years. What do you think? Did the human Tom and Jerry deserve better? Or were they destined to be replaced by one of the most famous duos in cartoon history? Let me know what you think in the comments below. This is Rich from Rerun Zone. Thanks for watching, and good night.